generally delivered with clients and with partners. So it's really something that we do in quite a collaborative way. And globally, Arup supports around 500 of these projects each year. And this sits alongside the projects that we, the research that we do on a standard project. So as all of you would know, any project that you're doing, particularly if it's something that is new or tackling a particularly tricky problem, research is always a component of this. But in the context of Arup's research program, we're really looking at things that are early stage or higher risk. So it's the kind of thing that we want to basically kind of kick the tires of it and test out before we start developing it and rolling it out onto projects. It's also something that's very foundational to Arup and foundational to who we are. I think some of you know that Arup is it's a company held in trust for the benefit of its employees. So that tends to give us quite a long lead time in terms of determining where we want to go into the future and what we want to look at. And it's really that helps us to reinvest some of our profits each year back into a research program. And it is very closely connected to the Foresight program, but perhaps we'll talk about this in a little bit. So I thought I might just take you through some of the projects, sorry, this is going slow, that are in connections. I won't stay with it too long so we can have more time for discussion, but just thought I'd provide a bit of context around why we've created this publication. So it's an outward-facing digital document. The purpose of it really is to help communicate our research to clients, but also to the wider public, to people that we collaborate with, to celebrate some of the research that we do, and to talk in a slightly different context than we might in an everyday business sense about why we find this to be important. We also engage in quite a lot of internal and peer-to-peer dissemination for our research in a different way, which we can talk a little bit about later. And anyone who has clicked through will know that because of sort of the breadth of our business, our research focus touches really on a wide range of sectors. You'll also see as we go through, our focus is, it's not really on pure or fundamental research so much as really action-based research. So we are generally looking at how do these things land on the ground. We do quite a lot of work with universities that connect into some of that more pure research. But for us, our focus is really, well, what does it mean in a built environment context for the next, say, 1 to 5 years? Our research is also generally delivered by teams drawn from the breadth of Arup. So we, as a research team, tend to pull together expertise from within Arup and external to Arup to support these projects. So the research team is small but mighty. We are only 3 people, so delivering 70 projects a year is a fairly big ask. So most of our role really is about directing the program, shepherding these projects, brokering partnerships, and making sure that it's solid gold research. So like I said, we've got 3 particular themes within Connections, and they're really 3 guiding themes that were supporting Arup region-wide last year. And when I say last year, Arup is a UK parent company organisation, so our new year starts on April 1st, April Fools. And the first theme for us last year was sustainable futures. And we use the lens of sustainable futures really to be considering how sustainable development goals, which can really seem quite abstracted, can land practically for us in a built environment context. And it's a really critical responsibility for architecture, engineering, construction, considering the amount of waste that is typically generated by these industries. And we know, for example, that we use concrete is the resource we use second most after water in the world. So it's a really critical question for us to how we start transitioning towards, for example, decarbonisation, what circular economy approaches look like. We really need to be a part of this solution. And our work in this spans anything from hands-on materiality. So we're doing quite a lot of work with mycelium, which is basically, kind of fancy word for fungus, which is fancy word for mushrooms, and how we can start to use that for things like acoustic batting, cladding, a whole range of different things. And some of the research that we do in this space spans anything from this kind of very practical hands-on research to developing and testing frameworks. So one of the key projects that we talk about in the research review for this year is circular renewables. So it's fantastic to see Australia in particular really embracing this solar revolution. But solar PV cells, very little thought has actually gone into the end of life use for all of this kind of equipment. So what is going to happen when 45,000 tonnes of solar PV are decommissioned in 2040? We worked with a whole range of clients and partners to explore what a circular economy for solar PV might look like. So what does this mean from a supply chain perspective? What does it mean in terms of sustainable paths forwards for industry? What does it mean for government use? And what does it mean for behaviour consumption?
We got a little parsley day.
Hey, oh, good.
Oh, good. So this is a report that I'll pop up the link for anyone to have a look at, but it's something that we've been using to talk to our clients to at early stages of development for projects, and it's really helping us and clients to understand what a generational impact might be for renewables and how to make clever choices early on. We've also been doing quite a lot of work around water, and of course, always a critical issue for Australia. And we've been looking at this in the context of water security in extreme remote communities and the potential for things like atmospheric water generation, which is basically a technology that can pull water from humid air and create drinkable water directly at the source. Our focus on this has really been on the energy aspect. So, a major input into any type of atmospheric water generation is going to be energy, and it's incredibly energy intensive. And for this reason, these kind of technologies have typically been quite niche and costly. So we've been looking at what the tipping point is around the fueling process becoming more affordable as these renewable energy sources are becoming available, as battery technologies improve, these kinds of things. It was a really interesting project for us because it also meant working with on-the-ground communities, bringing our technical expertise together with local communities who had an incredibly strong understanding of the environments that we were working in. So a really useful project in terms of cross-pollinating some of this knowledge. Now, our second theme is digital in the built environment, which for Arup is a really rich space. And we explore a whole range of aspects in this area, including digital fabrication. So I think we'll all be pretty aware that traditional construction sites can be pretty dangerous, and they can actually be pretty inefficient. They can often be very high risk, low productivity. And in terms of risk, the construction industry has the highest rate of injury in Australia. So a really critical one for us, not just in terms of how we can be building things that are quicker and more efficient, but also how can we be building much more safely while we're minimizing errors and waste. So digital fabrication, can really help to remove us from some of this dangerous and dirty work, while at the same time it's letting us play with higher form complexity and enhanced material efficiency. And the technology is really getting interesting in terms of pushing boundaries, but the industry has actually been quite slow to move. So what we find with quite a lot of our research is that some of the problems are technological and some of them are a bit more anthropological. Some of the challenges are actually getting industry to understand the benefits, getting industry to be able to adopt into supply chains, and working with government to help understand what this might mean in terms of new policy frameworks and the like. This is an image from a project that our acousticians and structural engineers worked on. It was the Our Planet exhibition, which was a partnership with Netflix, Google, Foria, and narrated by David Attenborough. It was an exhibition that opened simultaneously at the Art Science Museum in Singapore, as well as in New York and Bristol. It was really interesting in terms of an immersive environment supported by sensory, sight and sound. So AR gameplay was really highlighting how extensive human activity has degraded Earth, and using this really interesting image that was enriched with computer generated content. And the idea behind this exhibition was really acting as a platform to raise awareness around decision making and human impact. But the research angle for this was actually for us something quite different. It was around linking the idea of digital fabrication to sustainable development. So what we focused on here from a research perspective was developing parametric design to construction, workflows that can basically cut down on waste and cut down on CO2 emissions. And sending exhibitions around the world, building expensive display aspects, which are often just junked afterwards, is pretty grim on the environment. But there's also really interesting implications in terms of digital technology that's mature enough to inform remote fabrication and design by construction by non-skilled workers. So basically designs were created in Melbourne that could then be sent to Singapore using local environmentally sustainable materials, and they could be put together by non-expert labour. We've also been looking at behavioural analytics in the workplace using AI and IoT, and this is our Melbourne workplace for any of you who have been there. It's somewhere that I must admit that I haven't been for the past 5 months or so, but hopefully we'll get back there soon. A lot of our work in AI is really looking at how we enhance design and system optimization processes, and how do we manage complexity of data at scale. When we're looking to interpret the data through AI, we're also considering how that data interacts through IoT. So we have this kind of growing network of physical objects, devices, and sensors, which are all the things in this digital ecosystem. So how do we actually start to utilize that both in public places, but also in the buildings that we're helping to design and create? It's really at the core of this automated and responsive systems and spaces in the built environment. So when we're talking intelligent transport systems, autonomous vehicles, smart buildings, and smart cities. And this project, in our review, is considering how we can combine IoT, artificial intelligence, and big data with advanced analytic capabilities. It's a project that we developed up with partners at RMIT over a couple of years, which has been a really fruitful and interesting partnership. We used a digital twin of our new Melbourne office, and it draws data from sensors and the fit out to help understand how the environment and how different variables in that environment are impacting on well-being and productivity. It uses a whole range of things like geolocation tools, and it's using kind of these embedded sensors to really help us understand some things, not only around how the space is utilized, but to guide users to underoccupied rooms or seats, to help us with wayfinding and spatial optimization, and really understanding as well how people are utilizing the space. And a really interesting one in the context of post-occupancy evaluation. So often, we design, people move in, and then we're done. And when we run into challenges in the building, unless we actually have the data, it's very difficult then to tweak it in real time. The final theme that we look at is in the review is livable cities. And often this is looking at how we can bring together qual and quant big data sets to develop contextual evidence bases and advance human-centered design. It's also really a space for us to explore how to balance prosperity from a social, environmental, and economic area. In this project, we wanted to explore the challenges of harnessing private sector innovation and public benefit in terms of looking at mobility as a service. So we worked with clients in the public and the private sector through a range of workshops to identify risks to public benefit and then collectively test a framework around how central government governance and orchestration could support innovation while safeguarding that eventual public outcome. And the subsequent framework is really interesting one in terms of bringing in expert scale qualitative analysis that links to some of the quantitative criteria to help us to mitigate against adverse effects in terms of these transport transitions. The last project I wanted to talk about is one that is an ongoing project, and for maybe obvious reasons when I start talking about it, we wanted to examine what were the implications were in a built environment from a really huge demographic shift that's been quite under-researched in Australia. So 1 in 4 Australians live alone. At the same time, we have the largest household footprints of anywhere on Earth, and that 1 in 4 cohort is actually on track to be the largest demographic based on data we had before COVID, understanding that there may be some changes with that now. But it was essentially on track to be the largest single demographic within 10 years. And so understanding these kind of households is really critical for people like us who plan and design cities. What does it mean from a social cohesion perspective, but also what does it mean in terms of looking at things like energy intensity? So looking at this through the lens of the SDGs, we looked at what's driving the trend. It's a really interesting complex mix of things around aging populations, progress towards gender equality, cost of living and growing income inequality at the same time are potentially going to put the brakes on that trend. So it will be really interesting to see what that means in terms of a COVID situation. There's a lot of tension between this growth in smaller households and these larger footprints and the need to be much more efficient with our resources. So we were looking at this really in terms of, well, what does it mean to have these larger footprints with fewer people utilizing them? What's the impact on energy? And to test a whole range of different options in terms of reducing that inefficiency while combating isolation and also reducing vulnerability. The idea behind this was really that getting this kind of nuanced understanding of people, this demographic living alone, can create these better opportunities for us to harness this and start moving in quite a different direction in terms not only of the dwellings that we're living in, but also what does it mean for transport connectivity, what does it mean for precinct planning. Within that, we also explored things like build to rent options in terms of providing more efficient and effective options. This is also a project that we're now carrying into a second stage. Obviously with COVID, there's a huge range of questions around, well, what does it mean in terms of isolation? What does it mean in terms of loneliness? How does that impact our built environment? And we know that loneliness is certainly a key focus and one that we need to consider as built environment professionals. We know in the UK, there is a minister whose portfolio includes looking after loneliness. There's quite a lot of data that suggests that it's can actually be worse off for your health than smoking can be. So what does that mean in terms of how we can create built environments that might be supporting people to be living together in new ways, particularly in a COVID environment? So that's a really very quick snapshot of some of the work that we've been doing through the research review. And now I think we're going to open it up to questions. Is that right? Oh, mute.
Does anyone have any questions for Bree? I might just start off with one.
Yeah, sure.
I understand that your team of, so you have a team of 3, right?
Mhm.
Is that right? And you have around 70 research projects a year,
Yeah.
which seems just such a huge amount for 3 people. So you said you direct them and you kind of shepherd the projects. Is there a lot involved in helping the individual researchers to produce a consistent product that, you know, would go into a report like this?
Yeah, it's a really good question. And the answer is yes, absolutely. So we have a lot of people in Arup who've done a lot of research before, but also many people who have been in practice for a long time. It might be quite distant since they've last done research, and indeed they may have never done it, particularly when we start to get these really quite interesting projects where we're crossing over different areas of expertise. So I think it would be in fact, I can't think of any projects we've had for the last 2 or 3 years that haven't been multidisciplinary. So there's also quite a bit of work that is involved in helping people to understand different approaches and different research methods. So within our team, we have one person who is a 4-day-a-week hire, who essentially his entire job is to help people to shape this research. It's to help make sure that we are providing programs that are building people's capacity in terms of how they actually deliver the research. And we also spend an awful lot of time with people scoping up what that research looks like. So essentially how these research projects are developed. Some come from bottom up and some come from top down. So anyone at Arup, whether they are a graduate or most senior person in the company, can essentially pitch to get seed funding. We help them to develop up their pitches. We help them to test the viability, the feasibility, desirability of this. We help them to explore, has this work actually been done before? We then help them to shape up, you know, what is your research question? What's the context within Arup and external to Arup? And then we help them to shape a method, which of course, particularly when we start to get into questions of working with people, so qualitative data, it's often methods that that people may not be quite so familiar with. So we help to support them in terms of shaping that project. Often the running of the projects is somewhat more light touch, and then at the end of the projects we also help them to understand the value capture that's come out of that and how we can share and disseminate.
That's really interesting. I can see that you probably have to match their time almost with time from the team.
Yeah, and I think having 3 people is an interesting approach, and it's also an interesting approach within a company for the people to be delivering the research to largely be drawn from the company. So everyone within the research team does have at least some aspect of a different research background, but we're really drawing on the expertise of some 1,500 people throughout Arup to bring their technical understanding to the table, and leaning on us to really help shape that approach.
Yeah, I think that's interesting. I was just going to also ask, how do you decide which topics to research and which not to? Because obviously, like with a lot of this research, it's you might not necessarily have a business case because it's the very start of the thinking into a topic. So how do you pre-decide on the themes, or what guides you?
Yeah, it's another really good question. So we're guided in our general broader themes by a whole range of things, but predominantly really what our strategy is as a region. So certainly those 3 themes that we talked to earlier were things that we were looking at last year in terms of what we're seeing in the market already, and where we perceive the market needs to go. So you'll have seen a really huge focus there on what does a sustainable future look like and how do we help to support a transition within that industry. So we certainly dedicate the substantial part of our funding to things that are really targeted within that space. And I think there is an interesting and delicate balance around making sure you're doing projects that are large enough and cohesively rowing in the same direction to get impact without sort of diminishing the capacity to do research that spans the whole business. So partly picking those themes also helps us to create cohesive frameworks for everybody in the business to be moving towards. So for example, we have people who might be working in sustainability, we have people who might be working in structural engineering, and we have people who might be working in providing transport planning advice. So these themes also help us to make sure that there is a clear direction for the company. So we take our cues very much from that. We also spend quite a lot of time with our market and business leaders to understand what it is that they're hearing from the market. We also draw on a range of engagements that we have with universities and other partners to understand where technology is starting to go, where trends are starting to go, and to help identify gaps.
Okay, thanks, Bree. I think we've got Alison, do you have a question you'd like to ask?
It sort of leads from what you were just saying, but wondering about whether the business case of the research program generally gets quantified in any way.
When you say the business case, what do you mean, the initial proposal?
I guess no, more just like of having research happening at all, and whether that's just a given that Arup understands the value that's being delivered, or if there's any efforts made to quantify the value directly back to the business itself.
Yeah, absolutely. So we attempt to, well, we do quantify our value across a range of metrics. So we look at the tangible and intangible value to Arup as a firm and to our people. So that does include ROI, direct ROI, but it also includes things like, are we contributing as one of our objectives is to sustainable development goals? Are we supporting excellence in technically upskilling our people? Are we building stronger relationships with those partners and clients that we really want to be working more with? So it's quantified across a range of metrics. It also lends itself, I suppose, then to having a broader portfolio, particularly again, given that it's quite a diverse business. It also helps us to balance our investment portfolio. So we're making sure that we do definitely have a focus on ROI, but equally we're then able to balance that with projects that might be looking a little bit further out in terms of, well, how do we start to support regenerative design? So we are moving in that particular direction, which we believe as a firm is going to help us in terms of ROI in the long run.
Is that quantified? Is that reported on annually in some way, or?
It is. So that I suppose is the other core aspect of having a 3-person research team. So of course each team then needs to report back on their project and the outcomes of that project and the relative strengths and weaknesses. And taking a research angle, often those weaknesses can be really useful for us to understand how we tweak our investments into the future. But each project is required to report back, and then we run annual portfolio reviews to test outcomes. I think one of the challenges with research is that outcomes can often take some time to fully realise. So we don't tend to evaluate these projects for probably 9 to 8 months after the project's completed. There's an immediate close out of the project where we evaluate the immediate benefits, but then we do return to them later, because we typically find that it takes 9 months to a year before we start to see some of those benefits really realising prominently.
So Bree, where a benefit may be that it benefits Arup's reputation, that a piece of research would benefit Arup's reputation, how would you measure something like that?
Another good question. So in terms of reputation, and typically we would be looking for any of these projects to be hitting a number of different metrics in terms of value, but in terms of reputation, we can certainly do things like conferences. We can look at social media mentions. We do scraping within that space. Even in terms of research review, the value of having a digital research review is it also helps us to understand engagement, so we can track people who have been checking these projects. I mean, that's a really useful way I think we've found to elevate the digital components in terms of being able to track and understand how people have been engaging.
Interesting. That's good. Are there any other questions?
Not a question, more of a comment. Thank you so much, Bree. That was a really good appraisal. Like I actually stopped working with the team to be able to enjoy to listen to you. So no, but honestly, thank you so much. And I love how the broad range of topics that you just covered in less than 15 minutes. And it just shows the diverse number of research projects. And I love the framework that you guys have adopted in Bree, and how just very complex, but the way you run it makes sound really smoothly. So it's a lot I can take on from that result. Thank you so much for that.
Oh, thank you. I was speaking very, very quickly to cover that much information.
I think you did really well. So thank you.
I'd love to know how you go about disseminating the information within the practice.
Yeah, another really good question. Look, it's one of those things that can in fact be quite challenging because it is such a large practice. So there's a number of opportunities to do that, but at the same time, you know, competing for people's attention internally and externally is always a challenge. So we use a range of different mechanisms. A key one for us is actually when we're in the office doing office presentations. So we run lunchtime presentations. We run perhaps things like 5x5s, which is essentially 5 projects, 5 minutes. So we share a lot through that. We share a lot through internal newsroom, social media style. We disseminate externally in the same way. So we work very closely with our marketing and comms team as well to help support sharing internally and externally. We also do quite a lot of things like, you know, just be active on our own internal news boards, etc. And of course, we politely invite ourselves quite regularly to different team meetings. We also prompt business leaders to say, did you know someone in your team has been doing a fantastic piece of research? Critically within that is also making sure that we have these, I suppose, really quick snapshots and nuggets of the project, where it's a simple one-pager where people can see the outcomes of the project and the aims of the project, and then they're then able to take those and share them with their clients or with the rest of the firm. But we do rely a lot on our people to be sharing. Typically we find that the best pickup of these kinds of things is in fact just people being really passionate advocates for their own work and having leadership understand what projects we're running and being able to advocate for them.
Thanks. Alex, did you have a question?
I did. I also had an apology to make. I think I accidentally sent a whole lot of emails out last week to everyone, so that's me, and it's my fault, and I can only blame childcare. I don't know. Bree, hi. I was wondering if you had a pet research topic or area and whether it's changed in COVID times. Yeah.
Good question. And for those of you who don't know, Alex, in fact, used to be research leader at Arup. So good to see you, Alex, or to hear you.
Oh, right. Hang on. There we go. Hi.
Hi. So Alex, I feel like this is a bit of a Dorothy Dixon because I think you know what my pet research topic is. One of my core interests in coming to Arup and being part of the research program was really to work with the firm around how do we start to bring together insights from quantitative and qualitative data. So how do we start to understand what these different kinds of data sources might mean and how we can start to translate them into meaningful technical parameters. So once we start to get this qualitative data en masse, what does that then mean in terms of being able to translate it into a built environment outcome and evidences for that outcome? And in terms of COVID, I wouldn't say that it's necessarily changed my focus area, but it's certainly changed the inflection that we're looking at. So we're getting all of these new data streams at the moment, and we're in early stages, so it's quite difficult to draw any clear conclusions from them. But in terms of understanding from a built environment perspective what it means around in terms of how people will be using the city into the future, how people want to use the city into the future, how they will be able to use the city into the future, and how people's understanding of their mobility options, how people's understanding of safety within public environments in terms of, you know, do you feel safe and confident to move back into that environment from a health perspective, has certainly come much more to the fore.
Yeah, it must be fascinating times for city design, I would imagine.
It is. And I think that the question has always been not just about the building, but how do you get to the building and how do you move between the buildings and how, as well as how do you move within the building. I think all of these kinds of things are shifting quite dramatically at the moment. And it's still quite early days, but I suspect that there'll be some fairly substantial changes in the long term to how we move around. But equally, I suspect that many things will return to normal, perhaps more so than we anticipate.
Bree, Peter Racebeck.
Hey, Peter.
Great to see you here. It's all good. So I guess I'm just wondering that issue about the distinction between qualitative and quantitative data. So how do you build the qualitative into the research projects that you operate, I guess? And I'm kind of wondering how you do that within the context of engineering consultancy where everyone is running around being kind of quantitative.
It's another very good question. So certainly not all of our projects include the qualitative aspect, but within Arup, there's also a very strong practice that is focused on user design. So what does it in fact mean to design for people, and how do people use your environments once they've been created, and how can we actually learn to design better by getting a greater understanding about people's motivations and drivers? And I think you're right in that it's often a challenging conversation to have within an engineering context. In saying that, Arup is also a firm that has a large number of designers and planners within this space who often work at least on the fringes of this area. And in terms of how do we support these through research projects, we've had a couple of really key projects that have shown, I suppose, great success in terms of being able to fold that kind of data in and being able to demonstrate how it then translates into technical outcomes. So one of the key projects that we've developed was a piece around lighting and safety in the city, and that was developed with XYX Lab at Monash University. So another aspect of making sure that we're bringing in that qualitative aspect is working with universities and making sure that our methodologies are incredibly strong, that the kind of data that we're bringing in can be verified, that it's really robust. And that piece of work was really looking at kind of mass user generated data about where women and girls felt safe or unsafe within public environments, and then essentially kind of cross-referencing that with the different functional and technical parameters to understand what kinds of environments had a tendency to make people feel welcome or not. In the same way, the project that we were talking about a little bit earlier that we developed with RMIT in terms of workplace relied very much on a cross-pollination of data around how people were moving, what people were actually doing, with getting a much better understanding about why people were doing that. So it included qualitative surveys, for example. And one of our research projects that was developed some years ago, in fact, when Alex was with Arup, was around a project called Mobility Mosaic, which was looking at helping us to develop far more sophisticated network planning, because we realized that we knew quite a bit about how people moved around cities. You know, we have all of this technical content that helps us to understand how you get from point A to point B. What it doesn't necessarily help me understand is why you might not have gone the most direct route, why you might have gone via C to get to B. So we did some work there around getting user-generated data, and then using data and using an analytics engine to understand, well, why are people doing things that don't necessarily seem to be particularly logical, and what can we learn from getting a far greater understanding about what people's motivations and drivers are, and how their sense of feeling in an environment in fact impacts their use in a really dramatic way. So it's been a really interesting journey in terms of how we start to introduce that, and it's certainly not something that we bring into every aspect of every project, but so much of what we do is really around how do we create environments that work for people and work for different kinds of people. And increasingly I think that is built on an understanding that not everything works for everybody, and that we need to have a far greater understanding of how different people interact with different environments, how they respond to those environments. And in terms of making the business case for it, I think a lot of it is really around, well, we know that environments that people have affection for, that they feel a strong bond for, they're more socially productive, they're more economically productive, and indeed even from an ecological perspective, it can help us to start moving people in more positive directions. We know that greener environments, we tend to have less crime in these environments, people tend to be much more attracted to them. So being able to kind of start to build those databases has been really useful in terms of how we start helping to shape some of our design and research.
Yeah, that's amazing, I think. And I think that kind of research, dare I say it, is probably far in advance of some of the research I see kicking around our uni. That's a bit of a, maybe I shouldn't be saying that, but yeah, and I think certainly the XYZ lighting and safety project is a really good example of those sorts of things. And I suppose when we think about a post-COVID landscape, I think having intelligence or knowledge about qualitative issues or qualitative perceptions, or being able to then translate those into more usable quantitative data, I think is going to be really important. So I think it's good that you're doing all of that.
I think you're right, and all of our research to date suggests that what is going to be important in terms of getting people back to cities, getting people back to campuses, getting people back to public place is how can they feel confident and secure within these places, and how can we be designing different kinds of environments, and indeed environments that can flex and pulse as we may kind of move through waves, and how do we really understand what makes people feel good in a place. And when we think about people returning to a workplace, we know it's going to be more important than ever to amplify this focus on people's well-being. We know it's going to be important to focus on people's comfort in not only being in the workplace but getting to and from the workplace. So if anything, I suspect that COVID is going to amplify some of these data streams and their importance in design.
Yep, great, thank you so much.
Bree, I was talking to you before about classifying the type of research that you do, because I looked through the papers and I noticed that not all of them are testing hypotheses necessarily, but they're often positioning pieces, frameworks, explanations of the thinking and this type of thing. Would you be able to describe that a little more?
Yeah, I think all of our research projects are always looking to test a hypothesis. I think what we're talking to there is some of the outcomes, and how we communicate some of those outcomes might vary depending on the audience. So, for example, with the piece around atmospheric water generations, the hypothesis we're really trying to test there is what is the tipping point in terms of energy and cost and availability. And the outcome from it is really a report that helps us to understand not only that aspect of it, but you know, what is this technology? How can we use it? What is the case for making this technology? So I think within our research, we're always looking to test a question, whether or not it's kind of pure and fundamental research of the types that a university does. To be honest, probably not. It's far more action-oriented research. So we're generally looking to test something on the ground, and we're always looking though to verify whether or not it does in fact does what we think it's going to do, or if there's a better way.
Yeah, when I compare this research to the sort of research I was doing at uni, I think this is really great for industry, because you can get to the conclusion a lot quicker, and you can turn it into something really useful.
I think in the context of the research review as well, what we're trying to do there is really share our findings, and to be able to tell these stories in a way that is interesting, that is bite-sized, and that people are really able to understand what is often a very technical project. So the idea behind the research review is really that it's for a broad audience. So certainly in terms of being able to dive more deeply into these, we do produce a range of other things. There are a range of conference papers, for example, journal articles, etc., that really delve into some of the technical components behind this. But the idea behind the research review is really being able to kind of champion some of those findings and share them a little more broadly.
You mentioned conference papers, and do you also write for peer-reviewed journals?
Yeah, absolutely. So when we say we, I also mean Arup rather than a royal we, because again, it's generally the people who are delivering these projects are our people who work with us every day. So one of our metrics generally is around, well, where have we been able to contribute to that broader debate? So we look to contribute in an academic sense, we look to contribute to industry, we look to contribute to public discourse, and we're also interested in engaging with government and policy.
That's really amazing. And so do you help, so the people that are doing the research and going to speak at conferences, do you help them to prepare their papers and also to write up the papers for peer-reviewed journals?
It's a good question. We generally will help to pair them with someone at Arup who might be able to support them with that. And if it's been developed with a university, then there's generally already a support structure there. And within that space, our role is really to help them bounce concepts and ideas and to connect them with the other people at Arup. And there's an awful lot of people at Arup who do quite a bit of work in the academic space, whether that's as guest lecturers or regularly contributing to journals and the like. So there's a very vibrant research culture that exists. So it's often more about tapping into that space.
Thanks very much, Bree. Are there any more questions? Not at the moment. Do you think you could turn on your video cameras? I might just take a picture, because I'd like to just say a few words on LinkedIn and thank Bree for her time.
Might just jump us back
to
a non-seat picture.
Okay, hello, say hi. Excellent. Well, thank you very much. Have a great afternoon, everyone. We'll send you another invitation in a month's time. And Alex Sinicus, say hi, Alex. Alex is going to present next time. It'll be something related to the effect of COVID on our industry. And I will write to you probably around a week before that and send you the invitations. So thanks again very much. Thanks, Bree.
Thanks, folks. Alex, I'm looking forward to hearing you next time.
Terrific. Thanks, Jacqueline. Thanks, Bree.
Welcome.
Thanks, Jacqueline.
Thank you.
Bye.
Okay, bye.
Bye-bye.